In a bustling diner on the edge of town, a man named Mark sat in a corner booth, glancing at the clock on the wall. The red neon sign outside flickered, casting an eerie glow through the window. The air was thick with the smell of bacon and freshly brewed coffee, but Mark's mind was elsewhere. He fiddled with a crumpled piece of paper, a reminder of the decision he had made just moments ago. The breakfast rush had quieted down, leaving only a few scattered customers. An elderly couple chatted softly at the counter, and a tired trucker nursed his coffee while scrolling through his phone. But Mark's heart raced. He knew he had to go through with it. Today was the day he would pay in cash, and that choice was heavier than it seemed. Mark had always been cautious, blending into the background, but today felt different. She was filling a mug for the trucker, her eyes bright with friendly energy. Mark felt a lump in his throat. He needed to keep things casual. He cleared his throat, and when she approached, he forced a smile. He asked, trying to sound relaxed. "Sure thing," she replied, her warm smile easing some of his tension. As she walked away, Mark felt the tension creep back in. The reason he paid in cash was more than just to avoid a trace. He had a heavy secret weighing on his soul, the kind of secret that kept people awake at night. He looked down at the cash in his hand, feeling the crisp bills. It wasn't just money to him, it represented the lengths he'd go to hide the truth. A loud crash turned his head. The trucker had dropped his phone on the floor, a bright light flashing as it fell. The noise snapped Mark back to reality. He could feel eyes on him now, the waitress, the couple, even the trucker. Brief glances exchanged. And just like that, he felt it again, the stares, the judgment. Was it paranoia, or did they really know? The weight of their gazes pressed on him, but he kept his head down, focusing on his pancakes, when suddenly the diner door swung open. A chilling wind rushed in, and in walked three men dressed in black jackets. Their presence shifted the atmosphere as if someone had flipped a switch. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The men scanned the room, their eyes penetrating. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, caught Mark's gaze for a moment, then moved on. Their laughter was loud and boisterous, but to Mark it all sounded like an ominous echo. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were up to no good. Mark fought the urge to stand up and leave. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. Yet here he was, trapped in a booth, feeling small and exposed. He could see the three men at the counter now, ordering food like they owned the place. He swallowed hard, regretting the money he had brought with him. Then it happened. One of the men turned and looked right at Mark again, brow furrowed. The man's eyes narrowed, and Mark could feel the weight of suspicion. Mark didn't know if he was imagining it, but something about that gaze ignited a spark of dread in him. The man whispered something to his friends, and they all turned to look back at Mark. They all checked his face again. Sweat beaded on Mark's brow. Had he made a mistake paying in cash? Did they think he was involved in something shady? His mind raced through various scenarios, each darker than the last. What if they came over here? What would he say? As if on cue, the tall man approached Mark's table. "Hey," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Mark's heart dropped. He forced a nod, his mouth dry as sandpaper. The man leaned in closer. "We couldn't help but notice you sitting here all alone." The man studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. Mark wanted to reassure him, but the words felt fake even as they came out. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The man smirked, and for a split second, Mark saw a glimmer of something, not kindness, not curiosity, but something predatory. A cold tremor ran down Mark's spine. Did he know? Everything inside him screamed to get out of there, but his feet felt glued to the floor. Then something shifted. The tall man's friends approached, filling the space around the table, creating a wall of presence. The atmosphere became heavier, thick with unspoken threats. Mark's mind raced. Did he dare show fear? What would they do if he did? The taller man said. Mark blinked, taken aback. How did he know his name? "You sure you want to stick around here?" Mark swallowed hard again, looking from one face to another, trying to gauge their intentions. They were all checking his face again, and he could see them calculating. An intense silence filled the air, making the buzzing neon lights above feel more ominous. This was a moment, a turning point. There was something sinister lurking beneath their interest. His stomach turned, and he felt like a moth drawn too close to a flame. He hadn't just made a simple choice of cash over card. It had opened a door to something unexpected, something dark. "I don't mean any trouble," Mark said finally, forcing the words out, hoping to calm whatever storm had blown in. The tall man squared his shoulders as he leaned closer, suddenly serious. "You need to watch yourself, Mark. This town has more secrets than you think." He stepped back, and the trio turned to leave the table, laughter spilling out as they walked away. They headed back towards the counter, leaving Mark to catch his breath. He was shaking, not only from fear, but also from a sense of impending doom. Was he really in trouble? Mark's hands trembled as he glanced down at the crumpled bills again. They felt heavier than before. It wasn't just cash, it was a warning. Susan returned with his pancakes, setting them down in front of him with a cheery smile. She asked, an eyebrow raised in concern. "Yeah, just some guys," Mark said, forcing a smile that felt fake. He tried to focus on the fluffy stacks of pancakes, but they looked foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. How could he eat after that encounter? It felt wrong, like a betrayal of the invisible weight pressing down on him. The trucker at the counter had been observing too, and he glanced over, eyebrows knit in worry. Mark was suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. The noise of forks clinking against plates, the chatter of couples, and the whirring of the coffee machine all felt like a dissonant symphony. Yet beneath it all, reality was crashing down. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched, monitored. Every mouthful of pancake turned to ash in his mouth. What had started as a seemingly innocent breakfast had spiraled completely out of control. As he sat there, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe he overlooked the deeper meaning behind his choice. Choosing cash was meant to be safe, a way to keep below the radar. But in doing so, he had inadvertently created an enticing mystery for those around him, especially those men who thrived on probing the secretive. His fingers tightened around the bills as he decided to pay. He dragged himself back to reality, shaking off the fear. But when he stood up to leave, he felt the eyes on him again. They watched him, exchanged glances, and suddenly Mark was injected with a powerful urge to escape. He walked towards the counter, his pulse racing as the door swung open, inviting him back into the world outside. But a part of him hesitated. What if he was being too paranoid? Maybe he was overthinking it all. He stepped out into the harsh light of day, feeling the cool air hit his face. But there was no sense of relief. Instead, he felt a chill, a danger looming just outside of view. What had originally seemed like a simple morning had transformed into a moment of weighty decisions that could ripple through the fabric of his life. And as Mark made his way down the sidewalk, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, ready to unravel whatever secrets he was desperately trying to keep hidden. Each step felt like a dance with fate. In that diner on the edge of town, life went on, seeming so ordinary. But for Mark, the reality was stark and cold. He had chosen to pay in cash, and now he was left to carry the unshakable burden of uncertainty. And deep down, he knew he had just opened a door that would be hard to close. He paid in cash, and when he did, everyone in the diner turned to check his face again. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Mark could feel the eyes of the patrons burning into him. The usual chirping of clinking forks and soft conversations faded. Instead, silence draped over the room like a heavy blanket. A bead of sweat trickled down the back of his neck as he took in the scene. He had always been cautious, walking through life like a shadow. But today it mattered. Today was different. Mark sat in the same booth he always chose, a table by the window where the sun filtered through in gentle waves. The waitress, a bubbly woman with kind eyes named Jan, knew his order by heart: 2 eggs over easy, crispy bacon and a side of dark roast coffee. But today he didn't want the usual. Today he had a plan. As the waitress approached with her notepad in hand, there was a mix of excitement and dread in his stomach. He felt the cash crisp and heavy in his pocket. It wasn't just money, it was a shield, a barrier between him and whatever consequences lay ahead. "Good morning, Mark," she chirped, her voice a melody in the otherwise tense atmosphere. Mark hesitated, scanning the room. A group of truck drivers were hunched over their plates, shoulders brushing against each other. In the corner, a couple shared quiet whispers, the man occasionally glancing at Mark. Everything felt magnified. Even the buzzing neon sign outside seemed to hum louder today, as if the universe was daring him to make a choice. "No, Jan," he said, regaining some of his composure. The moment the words left his lips, Mark felt it, the shift. Several heads turned, curiosity peaked. Jan's smile faltered slightly, confusion crossing her face. "All right, you've got it," she replied, jotting it down before glancing towards the register. Mark's heart raced, pounding like a drum in his ears. He glanced at the door, half expecting something to come crashing in, a pang of anxiety gripping him that he couldn't shake. It was the thought of what lay outside that spurred him. A few short weeks prior, he had found himself wrapped up in something he hadn't intended. A mistake had been made, and now he was playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Mark looked down at the cash again. He could have used a card, but cards left traces, and traces could be dangerous. He needed to be invisible, needed to blend in with the walls of the diner. As he waited, he could feel stares on him, probing and penetrating. The feeling unsettled him. He focused on the table, willing the wood grains to tell him a story, if only he could disappear. His thoughts were interrupted when Jan returned, balancing a plate stacked high with eggs and bacon. She carefully set it down, almost too quietly for someone so lively. "Here you go, just like you like it," she said, her eyes darting briefly to the cash in his hand. Mark forced a smile. And then, as if on cue, the door swung open again. A trio of men entered the diner, all wearing dark jackets that made them look both intimidating and out of place. Their laughter echoed, filling the diner with a disjointed cheer that seemed to clash with the unease already bubbling beneath the surface. Mark's eyes widened as they ambled towards the counter. They scanned the room, their gazes sharp as hawks searching for prey. Mark sunk lower in his seat, hoping they wouldn't notice him. But somehow it felt inevitable. The lead man, tall and heavyset, caught Mark's eye. And just like that, the laughter died. The diner grew quiet again. The man's gaze shifted to Mark's face, then moved on, but Mark could feel the weight of that glance long after it was gone. Suddenly, Mark felt exposed. Everyone checked his face again, like they were trying to piece together a puzzle. Who was he? Why was he here, alone, with cash instead of a card? His heart raced as he forced himself to take a bite of his breakfast. But nothing tasted right, not the crispy edges of the bacon or the warm yolk spilling out from the eggs. Every bite felt like a reminder that he was caught in a web he had spun himself. The men at the counter were now whispering, heads close together, casting glances back at Mark. The tension thickened until he could almost slice it with a knife. What were they saying? Did they know? Mark's mind raced. Should he leave? Should he stay? He wanted to bolt for the door, the thought pulling at him with a fierce urgency. But what would that accomplish? Running would only draw more attention. He swallowed hard, trying to calm the storm inside him, but dread lingered just beneath the surface, gnawing at him. Perhaps he had underestimated the effect of cash, the danger it could bring when mixed with secrets. As he sat there, wrestling with his thoughts, he noticed a flicker of movement at the corner of his eye. The tall man had detached himself from his group, making his way toward Mark with a swagger in his step. Mark's heart sank. The man approached slowly, his presence almost suffocating. "Hey there," he said, his voice deep like thunder. Mark gulped, meeting the man's gaze. The confidence in the man's expression felt like a vice around his throat, tightening with each passing second. No. "Just breakfast," Mark replied, the words barely escaping his lips. The man smirked, assessing Mark as if he were examining something on a shelf. "You sure? You're here alone and you've got cash instead of a card?" An uneasy laughter rose, but Mark didn't join in. His stomach twisted painfully as the man leaned in closer, their faces just inches apart. "You look a little nervous there." Mark could feel sweat collecting at his temples. "It's fine," he managed to say, yet it felt like a lie that hung heavy in the air between them. The man's eyes sparkled with mischief, or perhaps something darker. He'd caught the scent of fear, and it only made him bolder. "Well, listen, it's a small town, people talk, and cash." Mark's mind raced. He wanted to escape, to slip out of the booth and disappear into the world outside. But the walls felt like they were closing in, the laughter from the men at the counter now ominous echoes of his fears. "Look," the man continued, "we just don't want any trouble around here." Mark nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. He was a stranger, an outsider, but even more so now, a target. The conversation twisted into an interrogation, and each question felt like a weight pushing him deeper into the seat. The man took a step back, and for a moment, Mark felt the rush of relief. But that feeling quickly dissipated as the man turned to call out to his friends, who were now watching with keen interest. "Hey guys," he gestured toward Mark. Everything inside Mark screamed for him to flee. Panic surged up his spine. There was something about the way they all checked his face again, aiming to dissect him further, that sent chills down his back. Mark felt trapped not only by the men but by the choices he had made. He had come here seeking anonymity, but all he found were eyes full of suspicion. Just then a thought struck him, a desperate plan. "Can I play this game?" he wondered. Mark straightened up, forcing himself to meet their gaze, refusing to back down. "They don't need to worry about me," he said, trying to sound confident. A murmur rippled through the group, and the tall man laughed, passing through, cash and all. Mark could feel the spotlight of their interest burning hotter than before. "Just out of town," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. The men exchanged looks, skepticism written all over their faces. There was a glimmer of disbelief that made Mark's heart race faster, but he couldn't let fear consume him, not now. In a way, he understood the psychology of it all. They were protecting their territory. He was a stranger playing by different rules, and that made him vulnerable. But vulnerability had to be hidden. He had to stand his ground. The tall man pressed, pushing in closer. "Just a quick trip. I have family to visit," Mark said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Yet his mind spun with the lies he was spinning, hoping they wouldn't catch on. For a beat, it looked like the men were going to press further. But then, a sudden shift occurred. Static electricity crackled through the diner when Jan returned with a coffee pot, pouring refills like nothing was happening. It was almost surreal, the way she disrupted the mounting tension, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. The tall man straightened up, glancing back at Jan with an expression that seemed to soften, if only slightly. He called casually back to Mark. Mark's heart raced as he realized that an invitation in a place like this could mean something much more sinister. "No, I'm good." Jan set the coffee down on the table, and Mark could feel his heart thudding painfully in his chest. His mind raced, trying to concoct an escape plan. But instead of retreating, the men resumed their banter, leaving Mark in a swirling whirlpool of thoughts. He mustered the last bit of courage he had. This was his moment to reclaim himself. "I appreciate your concern," Mark said, casting a sideways glance at the men, "but I really don't want any trouble." The tall man laughed, a deep rumble that filled the diner. "All right then." As he turned back to his friends, Mark felt a rush of adrenaline. He had held his ground, but the feeling of victory was short-lived. The glances still lingered, and the threat hung in the air. The men left him be for now, but he sensed that they weren't finished. Each minute stretched out, agonizing elements of time feeling slow, and soon Mark was finished with his meal. Feeling overwhelmed, he knew he had to leave. He picked up the cash, trying to appear nonchalant, but as he approached the register to pay, he felt their eyes on him again, checking his face once more. Jan rang up his meal, her cheerful demeanor masking her own apprehension. She asked, handing him his receipt. "Yeah," Mark replied quickly, urgency pushing him to act. He placed the cash on the counter, willing himself to appear calm even as his heart raced. The moment he stepped back, the tall man's voice chimed in one last time, sending a shiver down Mark's spine. "Have a good trip, buddy, just..." Mark nodded, trying to streamline himself out the door, the feeling of being watched pressing heavily against him. When he finally burst outside, fresh air hit his face like a cold splash of water. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the intensity that had enveloped him in the diner, but a part of him knew this wasn't over. He had made choices that would ripple out, and as he walked away, part of him wondered if he had paid enough for his cash transaction and the price for his secrets. In a small town, everything echoed. He had become a mirror reflecting their suspicions, and he'd need to navigate the dangerous waters that lay ahead. With every step he took, he could sense the shadow of their judgment trailing behind him. Mark understood in that moment that he had paid with more than just cash. Deep down, he was left with the chilling realization that sometimes the cost of remaining hidden could be more than anyone was willing to carry. He paid in cash, and they all checked his face again. It was a moment that changed everything. The diner was buzzing with life, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon hanging in the air. Mark sat in a booth by the window, the morning sun spilling in like liquid gold, but it felt more like a spotlight pinning him down. His hands trembled as he counted the bills, the crisp edges biting into his fingers. He was already on edge, but today felt monumental, like standing at the edge of a canyon, ready to jump. He wanted to blend in, to disappear into the bustling crowd, but things felt different. The waitress, a familiar face named Lisa, approached with a smile. She had always been friendly, a warm light in the grayness of early mornings. "Hey, Mark," the usual. "Yeah, that sounds great," he replied, forcing a smile, but his mind was racing. Today wasn't just any ordinary breakfast. Today was a choice, a risk that could either set him free or pull him into darkness. As she walked away, Mark glanced around. Regulars filled the seats, a group of truckers in the corner, a couple sharing a slice of pie, a few solitary figures lost in their thoughts, but there was a palpable tension in the room, something unspoken flickering behind their eyes. "What a beautiful day," Lisa said brightly, returning with his plate. As she set it down, her eyes flicked briefly to the stack of cash in his hand. It wasn't lost on Mark. The air shifted subtly. Her smile faltered for just a heartbeat. She asked, concern weaving into her tone now. "Yeah, just thought I'd change it up," he said, shrugging as if it was no big deal, but it felt monumental. Paying in cash had become a safety net for him, a way to disappear, to slip through the cracks unseen. The last few weeks had forced his hand in ways he never imagined. He took a deep breath as she walked away, eyeing the cash again. He had avoided using cards ever since the incident. Cards left trails. Trails could lead to questions, and questions could unravel everything he had tried so hard to keep hidden. Then, the door swung open, and in walked a trio of men dressed in dark clothing. They moved with an air of confidence that commanded attention. Their laughter was loud, and a part of Mark's gut twisted. Were they here for him? One of the men, taller than the others, had an easy charisma, too easy. He scanned the diner, and Mark felt the man's eyes land on him. For a heartbeat, the smile faded from Mark's face as their gazes locked. Then just as quickly, the tall man turned away, continuing toward the counter, but the weight of his stare lingered, heavy and unsettling. There was something deeply unsettling about their presence, like a thundercloud moving over blue skies. Mark fought against the growing anxiety spiraling inside him. As he took a bite of bacon, he noticed the three men huddled together at the counter, heads close, whispering among themselves, all the while stealing glances in Mark's direction. Now the diner felt like a pressure cooker, the heat escalating with every moment. Mark forced himself to chew, to swallow, but it felt like chewing on glass. Every mouthful was a struggle as he sensed the eyes locked onto him. The world continued to buzz and move around him, but he felt frozen. The men were too loud, too confident. Mark's instincts kicked in, warning him. They let out playful chuckles, but he could hear the underlying current of tension. In their laughter was something else, an edge that sent shivers down his spine. The tall man called out suddenly, snapping Mark from his thoughts. The laughter faded into a hushed murmur as the men shifted their attention toward him, curiosity mingling with scrutiny. Mark's stomach dropped. He managed, his heartbeat quickening. The man asked, a sly grin spreading across his face. There was a challenge in his eyes, a sense of danger that made Mark's skin prick. "No, I'm good," Mark said, trying to sound casual as he glanced around, willing someone else to support him, to provide an escape. But the other customers were engrossed in their meals, blissfully unaware of the weight descending on Mark. There was an uncomfortable pause, the atmosphere thickening with their scrutiny. Mark's throat felt dry. "I just like my alone time," he added, forcing a grin, but it only seemed to amuse the tall man further. "Suit yourself," he said, turning back to his friends who snickered behind him. But Mark could feel their eyes on him, and that deep need to flee surged again. He picked at his food, forcing himself to chew, yet the bacon felt like rubber and his stomach twisted with anxiety. Then he heard it, a quiet whisper from the group, a snatch of conversation he couldn't ignore. Cash instead of card. Mark's heart dropped. Had they caught on? What if they knew? He glanced out the window, searching for an escape route. The sunlight felt blinding now, illuminating the futility of his situation. Adrenaline pulsated beneath his skin. It was more than paranoia, it was instinct. He could feel the noose tightening around him, every second growing heavier. The weight of judgment hung in the air, and he was the center of it, an object of suspicion. "That cash you've got," the tall man said suddenly, interrupting Mark's spiraling thoughts as he stepped closer again. Clean, a single word packed with meaning. Mark's mind raced. They had to be asking questions, piecing together a story he wanted desperately to keep hidden. "Of course it is," Mark replied more defensively than he intended. The man raised an eyebrow, a knowing smirk on his lips. "I mean, we see a lot of folks here." Mark swallowed hard, his fingers twitching on the table's edge. The truth threatened to spill out. What exactly were they implying? He had settled in for a cup of coffee, and now he was a suspect in an invisible crime. Just then, Lisa returned with a fresh pot of coffee, the warmth flooding in like a balm. She asked cheerfully, oblivious to the tension at the booth. "Yes, please," Mark managed, his voice almost a whisper. He watched as she filled his cup, her presence a lifeline in a storm. The tall man leaned in, blocking Mark's view. "You know, it's easy to get mixed up in the wrong crowd." Mark's pulse quickened yet again. The threat was palpable as the words hung in the air. The impossible weight of secrecy rushed around him. "Don't worry about me," he replied, forcing confidence into his voice, even as doubt gnawed at his insides. "Good," the tall man said, flashing a sharp smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then, as quickly as he had approached, the man stepped back, strutting toward his friends like a king surveying his domain. Mark exhaled, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the breathing room was short-lived. The buzz in the diner seemed to return as a semblance of normalcy, but Mark felt anything but. He could feel the unease lingering, resonating deep within him. Paying in cash had felt like a necessity, but right now, it felt like a neon sign pointing at his flaws and fears. The trio erupted in laughter again, and Mark could feel their glances subtly shifting back toward him. Each laugh felt like a dagger, an unspoken reminder that something was clearly off about him. He finished his meal quickly, the food hardly touching his taste buds as he tried to combat the rising tide of anxiety. As he put his jacket on, he glanced at the men one last time. They were sprawled out at the counter, but their chatter had become deeper, more taunting. With each stride he took toward the door, Mark felt the dread spiral inside him, a vortex threatening to pull him under. Outside, he was greeted by a gust of wind, pushing against the weight on his shoulders. He stepped into the sunlight, the bright rays wrapping around him like a cloak of warmth. But when he glanced back through the window, he saw the tall man watching him. That knowing look in his eyes made it clear this wasn't over. Mark quickly walked away, trying to steady his breath. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears, a steady thrum pushing him forward. That moment in the diner would linger. The exchanges between them replayed in his mind, amplifying his anxiety with each step. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into a game he hadn't signed up for. The choice to pay in cash had started as a small act of rebellion, a way to gain control in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. But now it felt like a ticking time bomb, one wrong move away from erupting. In that diner, so innocuous yet layered with deception, Mark had crossed a line he hadn't even recognized was there. The streets outside buzzed with life, but Mark felt untethered, disoriented. He could no longer discern where he ended, and the threat began. In that moment, he realized that sometimes the price of invisibility could overshadow the safety it promised. Final powerful thought surged through him. The cash might have been a tool, but it also made him a target, and he had to tread carefully from now on. No matter how hard he tried to blend in, Mark knew his life had just taken a turn he wasn't ready for. And with the shadow of the diner looming over him, he felt that the game was just beginning. He paid in cash, and suddenly every eye in the diner turned to check his face again. The air was thick, charged with an electricity that crackled just overhead. Mark sat alone in a booth, fingers tapping nervously on the table, heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. It was supposed to be an ordinary meal, a simple escape from reality. But as soon as the crisp bills slid out of his wallet, everything changed. The diner was a dive, one of those places where the coffee was bottomless and the food was diner good. A group of truckers filled the far corner, laughing boisterously, their voices mingling with the sizzle of the grill. A mother and her daughter sat at a window table, sharing pancakes, the sunlight catching the syrup as it drizzled down the sides. Yet despite the normalcy around him, Mark felt more like a spotlight had just been flicked on. The waitress Lisa, with her bright smile and cheerful demeanor, approached. "Hey Mark," he forced a nod, his throat suddenly dry. Lisa had always treated him with kindness, but today that kindness felt like a weight pressing down on him. "Actually, can I get the pancakes?" "You got it, coming right up," she said, scribbling on her notepad. As she walked away, he exhaled slowly. The moment he'd handed her the cash, he felt a shiver run through the air like a whispered secret. Were people really looking at him, or was he simply paranoid? Cash was supposed to be a way to keep things discreet, but now it felt like an open invitation to scrutiny. A loud laugh from the truckers momentarily broke his concentration, but the laughter quickly transformed into murmurs. "It was always the quiet ones you had to worry about, right?" the players lurking in the background. Mark's mind raced with possibilities. He was digging himself deeper into a pit with every passing second. The truth was, he didn't belong here, not today. He had made choices that dragged him into a world he never asked for, and those choices were catching up with him like shadows in the dark. Then the door swung open, bringing a rush of cool air with it. A trio of men walked in, their presence darkening the room. They were dressed in heavy jackets, their bodies exuding a sense of control as if they owned the place. Their laughter echoed like thunder, radiating an energy that made Mark's skin prickle. For a fleeting moment, their gazes swept over the diner, and then, like a predator locking onto prey, they eyed Mark. He felt it, a piercing examination that sent a jolt down his spine. Every instinct inside him screamed to flee, but he was frozen, trapped in that booth he had chosen so carelessly. One of the newcomers muttered, tossing a nod in Mark's direction. Mark's heart raced. He couldn't tell if they were serious or making a joke. Was it the cash that had caught their attention? He quickly lowered his gaze, pretending to examine the menu that he had already memorized. Lisa returned with the food, her cheery demeanor cutting through the tension. "Here you go, pancakes and bacon, just like you like it." Mark nodded, forcing a smile through tight lips. But just as he picked up his fork to dig in, he felt it again, the weight of those men's eyes. The tall one with a chiseled face and dark hair leaned against the counter, clearly enjoying the atmosphere. He said, his voice teasing, almost mocking. The men were watching him again. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Were they serious? Were they really going to make a scene? And he was the focal point. Mark pushed his food aside, suddenly too anxious to eat. The sight of the pancakes blurred in his periphery, and he cleared his throat nervously. What was happening? He was just a guy paying cash for breakfast. Why was he suddenly the center of attention? "Maybe he's got something to hide," one of the men said, a playful lilt in his voice. Mark felt a chill brush against the back of his neck like a cold hand. Each word dripped with a heavy implication, and suddenly every tick and tock of the clock in the diner felt loud, echoing off the walls. Lisa came back with coffee, oblivious to the growing tension. She chirped, pouring a fresh cup in front of Mark. The men exchanged glances, their amusement growing. The tall one said, "Cash seems to attract attention." The laughter from the men sent another wave of anxiety crashing over Mark. He had thought that paying in cash would help him blend in, but here he was exposed, and they could smell his fear. The truth was, he did have something to hide. He could feel beads of sweat trickling down his forehead. Mark knew he couldn't stay here much longer. His instincts screamed at him to leave. But would they let him go? Would they follow him out? Would he even make it out alive? "Seriously though," the tall man said, stepping closer, his friends leaning in beside him, filling the space with an almost electric energy. "You think he's waiting for someone?" Mark's throat felt like sandpaper. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Panic fluttered in his chest, his muscles tense as he searched for an escape. He was outnumbered, and their scrutiny felt like a vice closing in. "I just came for breakfast, nothing more," he finally managed to say, his voice low. There it was, the warning flashing in their eyes, a glimmer of recognition as they checked his face again. The tall man said, a smirk creeping across his lips, "Maybe that's true, or maybe you're running from something, looking to vanish into thin air." Mark's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He felt dizzy, like he was about to be swallowed by the earth. They were playing with him, and the stakes were rising. "Seriously," one of the other men chimed in, his voice dripping with amusement. "If you're looking to disappear, might want to consider a new tactic." The tall one nudged his friends, then turned back to Mark, eyes glinting with mischief. Mark was at a crossroads. Before him stood an open doorway to desperation, an invitation to lie and fabricate stories that could lift the weight off his shoulders. But deep down, he knew what that could spiral into. "Lies have a way of hunting you down, following you like a bad dream." "Honestly, just trying to have a quiet meal," Mark replied, carefully controlling his tone. "Interesting choice of words," the tall man mused, as if testing him. In that moment, another part of Mark kicked in determination to stand his ground. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I'm just here to eat." "Sure, man," the tall man said, a sly grin on his face. "But just remember, in this world, sometimes it's better to keep your mouth shut." Suddenly, Mark felt the energy shift again, like a predator preparing to pounce. There was a glimmer of something in the tall man's eyes, a power play he was clearly enjoying. "This isn't a game. I'm not someone to mess with," Mark stated, desperation and defiance intertwining. For a moment, their gazes locked, a challenge echoing in the air, and Mark could feel the tension rippling between them. The tall man leaned in closer, and Mark could see the flicker of something dangerous. "But you showed your cards when you paid in cash. It's like waving a flag." A bead of sweat rolled down Mark's temple. His mind raced. The danger of being scrutinized weighed heavily. In that moment, he was overwhelmed with the stark realization that he was out of his depth. "Look," he finally said, anger tightening around his words, "I'm trying to eat my breakfast." The tall man raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, we'll let it go." As he stepped back, Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, yet he also knew he was not off the hook. They would remember this moment. They would remember him. Mark grabbed his coffee cup, trying to play it cool, but everything felt too tense to swallow. Each sip was like swallowing sand. The truckers had turned their attention back to their plates, but Mark could see that casual interest lingering. As he looked around the diner, he could feel the walls closing in. The thrill of danger had shifted into something darker, like a storm rolling in on the horizon. He might be in the clear for now, but the reality of his situation loomed over him like a ghost. "Word of advice," the tall man said, turning back one last time, a mischievous grin still on his face. Mark's heart felt like it would burst. The laughter from the trio faded as they wandered toward the door, leaving Mark with a sick sense of dread. The weight of their words hung heavily in the air, and every eye in the diner felt like they were still lingering on him. He didn't finish his breakfast. The food had become a cold lump in his stomach, unreachable. The tension refused to die like a lit fuse. Mark took a deep breath, reminding himself that he needed to leave. As he stood up, the door swung open again. A new group of individuals entered, fresh faces, but their eyes seemed to sweep over him in an instant. Mark felt exposed, laid bare in front of the world. In that moment, he understood something essential. Paying in cash could save him from being tracked, but it also made him vulnerable to a different kind of attention, a spotlight that shone in all the wrong places. As Mark exited the diner, his heart raced with urgency. He had paid in cash and opened a door he couldn't close. The world outside buzzed with life, yet he felt like an outsider. Stepping onto the sidewalk, he realized that being invisible was not as easy as he thought. The cash transaction had transformed into a warning, a reminder that secrets always have a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury them. He glanced back at the diner, its neon sign flashing ominously. Mark knew this might be a turning point, the kind that leads you down dark alleys. And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the game was just beginning. He paid in cash, and suddenly every eye in the diner turned to check his face again. Mark felt the weight of their stares like a physical presence, a tangible fog rolling in. It wrapped around him, tightening its grip with each fleeting second. He had walked into this diner looking for an escape, a simple breakfast, but now he felt like he was on trial. It had started out like any other Tuesday morning. The air was thick with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon, of all the things that usually brought him comfort. He took a seat in a booth closest to the window, the sunlight pouring in, glinting off the worn surface like a beacon. But today was different. Today was the day he would pay in cash. When Lisa, the waitress with a warm smile and shiny red lipstick, approached his table, her notepad poised like a sword ready for battle, Mark had to force his voice out. "Can I get the pancakes?" "Sure thing," she asked cheerfully. As she turned to walk away, that feeling hit him again, the eyes of the diners around him. It was subtle, and yet it could not be ignored. Could they sense it? His heart raced as he reached for his wallet. The choice to pay in cash had been intentional, a small act of defiance, or perhaps more accurately, survival. Moments passed like hours. Mark's hands were clammy against the worn leather of the booth seat. He could hear the clinking of forks against plates, the soft laughter of families sharing stories over pancakes, but none of it could distract him. He felt trapped, like he was standing in the eye of a storm while chaos swirled all around him. Then the door swung open, pulling in a gust of cold air. 3 men walked in, their dark jackets contrasting sharply with the vibrant diner. Their laughter boomed as they entered, an unmistakable sense of confidence radiating off them. The room's energy shifted, whispers traded among the patrons like the wind before a storm. Mark tried to sink deeper into his seat. The tall one with a chiseled jaw and sharp eyes scanning the room locked onto Mark's gaze. A chill ran down his spine as he felt those eyes bore into him, almost as if they were reading his very soul. In that moment, every thought about pancakes vanished. "Hey," the tall man called out, his voice slicing through the din of conversation. Mark's mouth went dry. He glanced around, hoping someone would intervene, but everyone else seemed preoccupied, too wrapped up in their own lives. "Just enjoying breakfast," Mark said, forcing the words out, but they felt flimsy, like glass about to shatter. "Nice choice," the man replied with a smirk that showed just the right amount of condescension. "But I gotta say, paying in cash," Mark's heart raced more. This wasn't just casual banter, it was an interrogation cloaked in laughter. The other 2 men stepped closer, and he could feel himself becoming the center of attention. Everything inside him screamed to leave, but his feet felt cemented to the floor. Lisa returned with his pancakes and bacon, placing them in front of him. The scent wafting up filled his senses, but all he could think about was the tall man's assessing stare. She asked innocently, sensing the shift in energy. "Yeah, just." "Busy today," Mark muttered, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He desperately forked a piece of pancake, chewing slowly even though his stomach twisted. "Busy, huh?" the tall man asked, leaning closer, invading Mark's space. "I just wanted to get some breakfast," Mark replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet the tension in the air constricted around him. The tall man leaned back, crossing his arms as his friends chuckled beside him. "You're sure you're not waiting for someone?" Mark's heart raced as anxiety pooled in his stomach. The truth was, he had been running from something. It was all so fresh in his mind, swirling like smoke. A few weeks ago, a decision had spiraled his life into chaos. A mistake had been made, and he had to pay the consequences. Mark remembered the night it all unraveled. It It had started innocently enough, a late-night meetup with someone he trusted, but it turned out to be a trap, one that left him scrambling to protect himself from the fallout. Suddenly, the shadows that followed him felt darker than ever, and cash transactions felt simultaneously liberating and dangerous. "I'm just here for breakfast," he insisted, the tension thickening around them. The tall man chuckled. "Sure, buddy." Danger hovered in the words like a thick fog, encapsulating Mark in a sense of dread. He had tried to remain inconspicuous, but it was evident that he had failed. The cycle of their curiosity was pulling him further into the spotlight, and each second that passed felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm. Mark had to pick his next words carefully, knowing that anything could tip the balance. "I'm not involved in anything," he said firmly, summoning all his courage. The tall man's voice was dripping with sarcasm. "You must be new around here." Mark wanted to scream, but instead he swallowed hard, gritting his teeth. "You're wrong. Interesting choice of words," the tall man replied, his grin widening. "What do you think, boys?" Their laughter echoed off the diner walls, and for a moment it felt like the walls were closing in, swallowing up any chance of calm. Fear bubbled within him, pushing against his ribs. He forced a smile, willing himself to play it cool, but inside, a storm raged. He glanced at his food, but suddenly it felt unappetizing, like stones in his stomach. The air grew heavier, the weight of their gazes piercing through him like arrows. "Look, I don't mean any trouble," Mark said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "I just wanted breakfast." The tall man leaned in closer, his expression shifting slightly. "Oh, we can see that," he said, lowering his voice as if to invite the others closer. "It's just, we have this rule around here." Their laughter mingled with whispers, and Mark's heart raced faster. "You gotta be careful, you know, folks will talk." Eager to diffuse the tension, Mark met their eyes, fighting back the rising panic within him. "I get it, it's just breakfast. Drama." The tall man straightened up, his tone dripping with mock innocence. Mark took a deep, steadying breath. He desperately needed to diffuse the situation, but felt like he was sinking deeper into a pit. "If you're not interested in breakfast, maybe you should just stick to your table," he shot back, surprising even himself with the edge of challenge in his voice. A moment of silence hung in the air, heavy and tense. The tall man grinned, momentarily taken aback. "Look at him, he's got guts." With a flick of his wrist, he motioned for the others to back off slightly, and a flicker of relief washed over Mark, but it didn't last long. The tension was still thick. He needed to find a way out. As if sensing his discomfort, Lisa returned, her presence a bright spot in a darkening room. She asked innocently, filling Mark's cup. "Thanks," he muttered, his heart still racing. "Looks like you've got fans," she said, glancing at the men. "Yeah," Mark replied quickly, avoiding the truth. Appreciated her warm smile, even if it couldn't breach the tension pooled around them. Lisa turned her attention toward the trio, her expression shifting slightly. "You guys have your own tables, right?" Just like that, Lisa's reassurance pushed back the invisible barrier of scrutiny, and the men reluctantly stepped back. "See, all good," the tall man said, folding his arms. "But keep in mind, Mark, people talk." Every nerve in Mark's body tingled, the implications churning like a storm within. He wanted to tell them to leave him alone, to let him enjoy a meal without being scrutinized, but the words stuck in his throat. "I appreciate the warning," he said finally, forcing the calm into his voice that he didn't feel, "but I'm just trying to eat breakfast." The men exchanged glances, amusement mingling with something more dangerous, like smoke curling in the air. "No drama yet," the tall man said, his voice low. Mark nodded, the sense of dread tightening like a noose around his throat. He had made choices that led him here, choices that had blurred the lines between right and wrong. Cash had seemed like a wise decision at the time, an attempt to keep himself safe, but now it felt like a spotlight shining painfully on his flaws. He wanted to flee, but the thought of showing that kind of weakness struck fear deep within. Instead, he struggled to maintain an air of control, reminding himself that he was still the one at the table, even if it felt like every move came with a consequence. With every tick of the clock, the scrutiny lingered, and Mark could sense the walls closing in. He had to get out, so he picked at his food one last time, the pancakes growing cold, the bacon forgot. Suddenly, rather than let them see him sweat, he made up his mind. He would not let them get the best of him. "Thanks for the warning, but I think I'll be fine," Mark said, his voice steady and resolute. "I didn't come here to start a fight." The tall man's smirk deepened. "That's your final word, huh?" Mark nodded, holding the tall man's gaze, refusing to back down. "Yeah, all right," the tall man said, finally relenting, stepping back slightly. As they walked away, laughter trailing behind them, Mark felt a cathartic release wash over him. He had stood his ground, but a small whisper of doubt crept in. Had he really done enough to shake them off, or was it bound to resurface later? Lisa stood by the counter, pouring more coffee for the truckers, a subtle encouragement in her eyes. Mark offered her a weak smile, grateful for her intervening presence in the midst of chaos. The weight descended once again when Mark looked around. The diners had returned to their chatter and food, but Mark remained acutely aware of the difference between feeling truly safe and the dread of being watched. He took one last bite of cold pancake, suddenly unsure if he had made the right choices. Cash had seemed like an easy way to keep things simple, but nothing felt simple anymore. As he rose from the booth, a chill ran down his spine, an awareness that he couldn't shake off. He paid for his meal, leaving a tip for Lisa as a silent thank you. The door swung open again, a gust of air cutting through the tension that had built. In that moment, Mark stepped into the world outside, feeling the weight of secrets still heavy on his chest. The laughter faded behind him, but he couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted. He had paid in cash and realized that sometimes, choosing the easy way out brings more complications than anyone could foresee. As he walked away from the diner, he understood that the game he was playing was far from over. The world outside buzzed with life, but Mark knew one truth: some choices bind you tighter than chains, and the price he had paid was only just beginning to unfold. He paid in cash, and without missing a beat, every eye in the diner checked his face again. The moment hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Mark sat in the far corner booth, the familiar smell of fried bacon and strong coffee wrapping around him like a warm blanket, but today was different. Today felt electric. As he flicked through his usual breakfast order, his heart raced. The waitress, Carol, approached with her notepad in hand, her cheerful smile a stark contrast to his growing anxiety. Morning, Mark. Mark hesitated, glancing down at the crumpled bills in his pocket. It's just a breakfast, he reminded himself. Can I get the pancakes? She chirped, walking away. He felt a weight settle in his stomach as she disappeared into the kitchen. He had decided to pay in cash as a precaution, a way to stay under the radar, but that decision set off alarms. He had been carefully avoiding attention, but here he was, feeling the eyes of every diner bore into him. It was as if they could sense his unease, and it unnerved him. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. To the casual observer, he was just an ordinary guy having breakfast, yet he knew better. Each time he glanced around, he noticed a couple of men in the booth across the way. They were whispering to each other, occasionally casting sidelong looks in his direction. There was something about their demeanor, an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Just then the door swung open, causing a rush of cool air to sweep through the diner. In walked three men, all clad in dark jackets that seemed to absorb the light around them. They exuded an air of confidence that felt predatory. Laughter erupted from their cluster, filling the space with an energy that rattled Mark. He instinctively sunk lower in his seat. He could feel the weight of their gaze land on him almost instantly. Tall one with rugged features and eyes too sharp for comfort met his stare and raised an eyebrow. Well, look who we have here, he said, his voice ringing with mock enthusiasm. Mark's stomach twisted, a silent scream filling his throat. He focused on his plate, trying to will himself invisible. His heart raced, each beat echoing louder than the diner's ambient noise. Was he imagining their interest, or did they actually know something? One of the men asked, a sly grin creeping across his face. Mark felt exposed. They were playing a game with him, and he was suddenly acutely aware of how vulnerable he was. He was the lone figure surrounded by a pack, and that circle was tightening. I just needed breakfast, he said, trying to sound nonchalant. Seems like a big deal to us, the tall man said, crossing his arms. His voice dripped with sarcasm, and the laughter from his companions melded into the din, enhancing the sense that he was under a spotlight. Mark's mind raced. What had begun as a simple desire for pancakes had transformed into something far more sinister. Where had the innocence gone? Just breakfast. I'm not looking for trouble, Mark insisted, even as doubts started to gnaw at him. What if they were right? What if his choice to pay in cash marked him as someone to be scrutinized? The tall man leaned closer, invading Mark's space. Mark could smell the faint scent of cigarettes mixed with the cologne he wore, a combination that made his stomach turn. We know how things work around here, he said, smirking. Mark's pulse quickened. Panic began to bubble up inside him, choking his words. Lisa returned with his food, placing it in front of him like a lifeline. Thanks, he said, forcing a smile, grateful for her familiar presence. But even as he spoke, the tall man remained unwavering, his eyes locked onto Mark's face. Looks delicious, the tall man drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. Mark felt heat creep up his neck. He forced himself to look the man directly in the eye, willing his voice to remain steady. I don't know what you're talking about. The trio exchanged glances, amusement dancing in their expressions as they stepped back momentarily. Whatever you say, champ, the tall man said, shrugging nonchalantly. Just remember, people have prying eyes. Mark stared at his plate, his appetite slipping away. The pancakes sat there taunting him, each bite now feeling like a rock in his stomach. He glanced around the diner, noticing that a few heads seemed turned in his direction. Was it the men's laughter, or was there something about him, something they could smell? Don't sweat it, one of the companions chimed in, his voice lighter. We're all friends here. But the threat lingered beneath the surface. Mark took a deep breath, grateful for Lisa's friendly demeanor as she refilled his coffee. She asked, her bright smile almost soothing the tension. Just chatting, Mark forced out, his voice strained. Good to hear, let me know if you need anything else, she said before moving away. Once she was gone, the attention snapped back to Mark, sharper than ever. Look, the tall man said, leaning in again. We're just looking out for you, buddy. Cash can lead to complications. Mark felt trapped, like a man hanging by a thread above a dark pit, each passing moment reducing his grip on reality. "I'm fine, I really am," he insisted, though the words felt more like a mantra than truth. The tall man shot back, his eyes narrowing. Mark snapped, surprising even himself at the sudden outburst. The diner fell silent for a brief moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The tall man stepped back, his friends following suit, but Mark could still feel their eyes on him, sizing him up. He sensed he had crossed a line, but maybe it was a gamble worth taking. "Keep it cool, Mark," the tall man finally said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "We'll leave you to your breakfast." As they started to move away, Mark's heart rate began to slow, but the feeling of dread remained. He could sense that this wasn't over. The encounter would linger like an ever-present shadow. The truckers resumed their laughter, the ambience of the diner returning to normal, but Mark felt anything but normal. His mind raced, grappling with thoughts that spiraled in every direction. He tried taking a bite of his meal, but the food tasted bland, reminding him of the confrontation that had unfolded. The moment had felt surreal, as if reality had warped around him. He was paying for pancakes, after all, not starring in a twisted drama. Mark mentally replayed the encounter, piecing together clues, trying to pinpoint why it had spiraled into a confrontation. Had he drawn them in, or had they been waiting for someone like him to stumble into their orbit? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. He was no longer just another guy sitting in a diner. He was a target. With every passing moment, Mark felt urgency building inside him. He needed to escape to make sure no one had followed him. He took a deep breath, wiped his palms on his jeans, and gathered his wits. But as he rose from the booth, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. The tall man was lingering by the door, watching him intently. His companions were at the counter, throwing glances Mark's way as they murmured among themselves. Mark managed to pay Carol a few bills, forcing himself to keep his composure. As she handed him change, he felt the confrontation hanging thick in the air, like smoke from a fire that wouldn't go out. She said, her cheer almost mocking him as he walked away. "Yeah, you too," he replied absently, trying to shake off the feeling of anxiety gripping his chest. As he approached the door, his feet felt heavy, weighed down by the uncertainty trailing behind him. The tall man's gaze remained fixed on him, a challenge without words. As Mark pushed the door open, the cool air hit him like a splash of cold water. He stepped out onto the street, but the feeling of being watched remained sticky on his skin. He glanced back to see the tall man still standing by the door, arms crossed, a knowing smirk plastered on his face as if to say he had won this round. He could feel the walls of the diner cut off behind him, closing in on an uncomfortable past. The moment he had paid in cash had become a turnstile, ushering him into an uncertain territory he didn't fully understand. How had something as simple as breakfast turned into a dance with danger? Was it truly as casual as this? Mark's chest tightened at the prospect of what lay ahead. As he walked away, the streets felt like a labyrinth. Could he outrun the nagging sense of dread? He had wanted to remain invisible, to find solace among strangers, but now that very desire had morphed into an anxiety he couldn't shake. That choice to pay in cash had created ripples in a world Mark no longer felt safe in. And as he hurried down the street, every fleeting glance seemed to pierce through him like daggers. He had made a decision, but it was clear now that the consequences were only beginning to unfold. With every step, Mark was reminded of the thin line he walked, a delicate dance between freedom and fear. And as he stepped into the chaotic pulse of the city, one thought lingered heavy on his mind. When you play with cash, you might just pay a price that goes beyond dollars and cents. The stakes had risen higher than he ever anticipated. And as the echoes of his choices faded, the game had truly only just begun. He paid in cash, and they all checked his face again. The diner was buzzing with the usual morning chaos, hissing grills, the clinking of forks, and chatter that filled the air like the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Mark sat in a booth near the window, the sunlight casting a warm glow against the worn leather. But despite the inviting atmosphere, a heavy tension settled in his stomach. Today felt different. Mark had always preferred breakfast at this small diner. It was where every face was familiar, where he could slip in and out unnoticed. But this morning he felt like a spotlight shone right on him, exposing every detail of his reality. As he glanced around, he noticed the usual regulars, a group of truckers laughing heartily in the corner, a mother teaching her child how to stir syrup onto pancakes, and a couple lost in their own world. But behind the friendly chatter, something lurked. When the waitress, a bright-eyed woman named Sarah, approached, her smile felt forced, like she sensed the tension hanging in the air. "Morning, Mark." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I'll have the usual." She scribbled it down, but her eyes flicked to his hands where the bills rested. It was just an ordinary transaction, but the cash felt heavy. Each bill represented a choice one he hoped wouldn't come back to haunt him. As she walked away, he felt the weight of eyes lingering on him again. The laughter from the truckers quieted, and he could sense their curiosity shift toward him. It was as if they were trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. He forced himself to breathe normally, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being scrutinized. Then, as the door swung open, bringing a gust of cold air with it, Mark froze. In walked three men, their confidence palpable, echoing against the walls of the diner. They were dressed in dark leather jackets. Each step they took spoke volumes of authority. The trio laughed loudly, and the laughter echoed like thunder. The tall one, the leader of their pack, had a strong jaw, and his eyes darted around the room until they landed right on Mark. A chill ran down Mark's spine as he made eye contact. The man's gaze narrowed, scrutinizing him as if he were a specimen in a lab. Mark's heart raced. He shifted in his seat, hoping to fade into the background, but the man's stare felt like a spotlight, forcing him back into reality. The tall man called out, walking closer, his voice smooth yet filled with an undercurrent of danger. Mark looked at the table next to him empty. He shook his head slowly, trying to appear calm. "Good," the man said, plopping down across from him. His two friends settled close, filling the space with their energy. "We were just checking the place out, and what do you know?" Mark felt his stomach drop. He had made that choice intentionally to stay under the radar. At that moment, it felt more like a mark on his forehead. "Just trying to keep things simple," he replied, forcing his voice to steady. The tall man leaned closer, a smirk playing on his lips. "Cash can lead to complications." Mark's heart raced as the man's piercing gaze searched his face. "Keep cool," he thought, but inwardly he felt like a marionette, strings pulling tightly, his every move watched. "They say cash is king," one of the man's friends chimed in, leaning back casually, a sly grin plastered on his face. "Depends on how you use it," Mark shot back, trying to inject some bravado into his voice, even as the weight of their scrutiny grew more intense. The tall man asked, crossing his arms. There was an undertone in his voice, a challenge embedded in the friendly facade. Mark glanced out the window, searching for an escape route, but there were no answers in the peaceful morning outside. "Just passing through," he said, forcing a smile. The tall man leaned closer, eyebrow raised. There's a fine line between a good story and a bad one." The tension in the booth thickened, wrapping around Mark like a tight belt. Every instinct within him warned him to flee, to leave this encounter behind. Willing himself to be bold, he leaned in as well, forcing confidence into his voice. "I'm not interested in trouble, just trying to enjoy my breakfast." Gestured toward the half-empty plates on other booths, hoping to shift the focus. "Ah, but you see," the tall man continued, undeterred, "you've already set off alarms, my friend. Cash isn't just cash, it's a signal." Mark felt trapped like a fly caught in a spider's web. Every word from the tall man wrapped tighter around him, and he struggled to find a way to escape this conversation. He forced himself to breathe, remembering the mantra he had used to get through uncomfortable situations. "Focus on the present, keep your head down. I don't know what you're looking for," Mark said slowly. "I'm just a guy having breakfast." "Drama finds us, my friend," the tall man replied, the corner of his mouth curling into a smirk again. Mark glanced around the diner, attempting to gauge the reactions of the other patrons. The truckers were still chatting, their laughter now muffled in the background. No one else seemed aware of the storm brewing in this corner booth. Tall man pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly, his tone now a low growl. Mark clenched his fists beneath the table, the weight of his fear pressing against him. The truth was, he did have something hidden, a past he was trying to escape. He couldn't let them draw it out of him. "Just a man trying to get by," he said, forcing a nonchalant shrug. The tall man leaned back, folding his arms, still sizing him up. Cash is like fuel for stories. Every note has a journey, it's been passed around." The tension twisted tighter around Mark. Anxiety slithered into his mind, whispering fears he tried hard to silence. Why had he decided to pay in cash today? Had he unknowingly walked right into trouble? The air was thickening, pressing in on him, and every breath felt like a weight. But in this moment, he couldn't afford to show fear. He had to project an image of calm. "You're really not giving me much to work with," the tall man said, his voice smooth yet commanding. Mark dared to look up then. For the first time since they started this back and forth, he met the tall man's gaze fully. "I'm just here for breakfast." Their eyes locked, and for that brief moment, the world outside faded away. Mark could see a flicker of respect in the tall man's eyes, maybe even curiosity, but those emotions quickly vanished beneath an ever-present challenge. "Fair enough," the man said, returning to his laid-back demeanor. Mark nodded, the tension still weaving through the air like a tightrope. Just then, Sarah returned with coffee for Mark, pouring it gently, her presence a welcome distraction. She asked, glancing at the trio. "Just fine," Mark said, forcing a nonchalant smile, grateful for her familiar warmth. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said before moving away. As the door swung open again, Mark felt a rush of cold air. He turned to see someone enter the diner, a woman in a brown coat, her eyes scanning, but then they landed on him. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. Was she here for him? Discomfort settled back in his chest, and he felt the tall man's gaze shift to her too. He asked, a hint of amusement creeping back into his voice. Mark didn't like where this was going. He felt the anxiety tugging at him, wrapping tighter around his mind. The woman walked further in, and the tension in the diner shifted again. The tall man leaned back, noticing the change in the atmosphere. "Looks like you've got company, Mark," he said. Mark shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. The woman approached their booth. She called out, her voice cautious. The moment her eyes met his, recognition flickered across her face, a spark of familiarity that sent a jolt through him. The tall man, sensing something, remained at the edge of alertness. He asked, a hint of suspicion in his tone. "Someone who knows me," Mark replied, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," she said softly, stepping closer. "I saw you come in." Worried, Mark turned defensive. The last thing he needed was someone to blow his cover, to expose the turmoil he was trying to navigate. The trio watched intently, and Mark felt himself being cornered again, as if the mere presence of this woman drew attention he desperately wanted to avoid. "Just the way you left things," she whispered, glancing nervously at the men. Mark interrupted, frustration spilling over. She opened her mouth to reply, but the tall man interjected, "Seems like you two have some history." His voice was laced with amusement, as if he enjoyed the chaos unfolding. "What do you have to hide, Mark?" The way he leaned in and scrutinized her was unnerving. Mark felt boxed in, trapped between a past he wanted to escape and a present that wouldn't let him breathe. "Leave her out of this," Mark shot back, his voice low but firm. The tall man's amusement seemed to deepen. He turned back to his friends with a smug grin. "You see, this is why cash is dangerous." Mark's heart raced. This was all spinning out of control. He had been paying in cash with the hope of blending in, but it had magnified every possible detail, replicating his fears. As he looked at the woman, he recognized her concern reflected in her gaze. She wanted to help. Yet the interactions around them felt like a precarious dance, tipping the balance of safety and danger. Mark insisted, throwing a glance back at the tall man. The tall man chuckled smoothly, leaning back with one arm draped lazily over the booth. "But I do know how to read a room, and today..." The sense of danger loomed larger, and Mark felt the walls of the diner press in on him. Every glance from the group weighed heavier. With every beat, the situation escalated. Frustration flared inside him, a desperate desire to reclaim control over the narrative that was spiraling out of hand. "This isn't a game," he said, his voice steadying. The tall man shrugged, unfazed. "Maybe, or maybe it's just the beginning." Mark felt trapped between decisions, caught between the comfortable familiarity he craved and the chaos that threatened to engulf them all. The truth was, he didn't know what came next. All he wanted was breakfast and an escape from the looming shadows of his past. "Look," the woman said softly, her eyes flickering with concern, "I can help." In that moment, the world outside the diner seemed to blur, drawing Mark in. The air was charged with tension, and every heartbeat echoed in his mind. He looked between the tall man, his friends, and the woman standing before him, each representing different parts of the reality he was struggling to navigate. He had a choice to make at that very moment, and whatever decision he landed on would ripple through his life like a stone dropped into still water. "I don't need help, I'll figure this out," Mark finally said, forcing strength into his voice. And with that, the tension snapped as if a thick fog had lifted. The tall man laughed again, a sound that vowed to haunt him as they backed away, retreating to their booth. Mark turned to the woman, the weight of amazed relief flooding through him. "I'm sorry you got pulled into this," he said, his voice softer now. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," she replied gently. The ordeal wasn't over. A shadow still lingered throughout the diner, but at that moment Mark felt a sense of resolve wash over him. He wasn't just here to take punches, he was also here to stand his ground. However, the ghost of fear prickled at him. He'd paid in cash, hoping to blend in, but had only called more attention. "Things are changing," he said, determination dripping from his tone. "I didn't want it to come to this. Sometimes simple makes it harder," she replied, her eyes searching his face. Mark felt the sincerity behind her words. He realized how tenuously safe his carefully constructed lie rested, how dangerous the wrong decision could be. Each moment echoed with the realization that choices matter, and in this small diner, he had unwittingly placed himself at the mercy of fate. "I'll figure this out," he replied, his voice now less buoyant, more certain. And in that acknowledgement lay a bond of flicker of hope amidst the uncertainty. As Mark looked around the diner, the familiar noise of patrons eating and laughing slowly resumed, but he could feel the tension still simmering beneath the surface. He paid in cash that day, and while it drew unwanted attention, it also ignited a fire within him. A realization that he couldn't run from his past forever, but he wouldn't let it define his future. As he gathered his things, ready to step back into a world teetering on the edge of chaos, Mark silently vowed to take control, to write his own story. The choice was his, and as the echoes of his cash transaction lingered in the air, he stepped outside, ready to face whatever came next. He paid in cash, and they all checked his face again. The diner was a bustling hive, filled with the rich aroma of frying bacon and the sharp scent of fresh coffee. Sunlight poured through the large windows, illuminating the red and white decor, creating a warm vibe where familiar faces gathered day after day. Mark sat at his usual booth in the back, a cozy spot often occupied by regulars, each lost in their own world. But today, an unsettling tension hung in the air, electrifying the atmosphere. He shifted nervously in his seat, glancing around as he pulled out a few crumpled bills. The cash felt surprisingly heavy in his hand, each bill a reminder of the decision he'd made earlier. Today would be the day he paid in cash. It seemed simple enough, a harmless choice. But as he watched the other patrons, he sensed the change it had wrought. When Lisa, the bubbly waitress, approached with her notepad, Mark could feel a knot tightening in his stomach. "Hey, Mark," she greeted him, her smile bright but her eyes lingering a moment too long on the cash in his hand. "Actually, can I get the pancakes today?" he replied, forcing himself to sound casual. "Sure," she responded, but he caught the slight hesitation in her voice, her brow slightly furrowing. As she walked away, he felt it, a ripple of eyes drilling into him. Mark quickly scanned the area, landing on the booth across the way where a group of burly men sat, their laughter abruptly silencing as they turned to look at him. Their expressions were unreadable, but the sudden quiet felt like a shift in the wind. Mark's heart raced. Were they watching him? It couldn't just be coincidence. He was just an ordinary guy, but somehow he felt like a spotlight settled on his shoulders, exposed and vulnerable. He tried to shake off the feeling as he stared at the syrup-soaked pancakes in front of him once Lisa returned. The door swung open, letting in a gust of chilly air. In walked three imposing figures, men dressed in black coats, the kind that screamed trouble from a distance. The energy shifted instantly as they entered, their laughter booming through the diner, and Mark found himself instinctively sinking deeper into his seat. The tall one with dark hair scanned the room, and without warning, his eyes locked onto Mark. There was something sharp about his gaze, a predatory quality that sent a chill down Mark's spine. As their eyes met, Mark could feel the weight of an unspoken challenge swirling in the air around them. The man called out, striding toward Mark's booth with an arrogance that seemed to suppress any notion of personal space. The others followed close behind, laughter trailing like a dark cloud. Mark's stomach turned. This wasn't good. He managed to croak out, wishing he could retreat into the safety of his booth. The tall man leaned closer, his voice low, taunting, a predatory tone that reinforced Mark's instinct to flee. "Just having breakfast," Mark replied, determination weaving into his voice, though it trembled slightly under the glare of the trio. "Breakfast, huh? Cash, I see." The man smirked, his friend snickering in the background. Mark's heart dropped. They had noticed. Somehow they knew his choice was a signal, a desperate attempt to fly under the radar. The tall man crossed his arms, leaning his weight onto the table as if claiming territory. "Seems like you've caught our interest, paying in cash." Mark's pulse quickened, the thought raced through his mind. The choice had seemed harmless at first, a protective measure, a means of anonymity. But now it felt like a spotlight, drawing unwanted attention to the silent chaos swirling beneath the surface of his life. "Look, I'm just trying to enjoy my meal," he replied, striving to maintain his composure, but the confidence he tried to project felt flimsy. The tall man leaned in even closer, their faces inches apart. A bead of sweat collected on Mark's brow as anxiety clawed at him. What if they were right? What if he was just a naive fool who had made the wrong choice in a world where danger lurked in unexpected corners? The men exchanged glances, their amusement fueling this unpredictably escalating situation. The laughter that once filled the room gradually faded, tension rising like a thick fog. "Let me guess," the tall man continued, his smile turning into a smirk. "You've got a story, don't you?" Mark felt trapped, caught beneath their penetrating stares. Every instinct urged him to flee, to push past them and escape out into the bright daylight, but his feet felt heavy, as if glued to the ground. He said, forcing a laugh that felt hollow. "Maybe," the tall man replied, crossing his arms, "or maybe you're just a regular guy trying to look inconspicuous. Cash can do that for you." His words sent a shiver down Mark's spine. The realization cut deeper. This wasn't just about breakfast. This was a confrontation that threatened to unravel everything he'd built for himself. Just days before, he had made a choice that seemed like a solution, a way to escape something he never intended to confront. Now it threatened to catch up with him. "I'm not hiding from anything," Mark asserted, the defiance in his voice surprising even him. The tall man raised an eyebrow, studying him as if deciphering a code. "Interesting, but keep in mind, mister, this is a small town." Before Mark could respond, the door opened again and a gust of wind swept through the diner. A woman stepped in, her presence striking and immediately commanding attention. Mark's heart raced. She looked familiar. He had seen her before at the edge of his peripheral vision. Could she be part of the reason for his heightened anxiety? The tall man and his crew turned to her, curiosity bubbling in their expressions as they momentarily forgot about Mark. He took this opportunity to inhale deeply. What was she doing here? The woman's eyes darted around the room as if scanning for something, and then they landed on him. She called out, her voice slicing through the tension like a knife. His breath caught. He briefly considered retreating further into the booth, but the tall man's laughter brought him back to reality. "Looks like someone's come to rescue you," the tall man mocked, turning back toward Mark. "Oh, I'm not here to rescue him," she said, stepping closer, her demeanor calm, but her eyes held an intensity that left Mark feeling exposed. "I'm just here to check in." Mark clenched his jaw, irritation boiling beneath his skin. Would she blow his cover? "I'm fine," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but his heart pounded wildly beneath the surface. The tall man leaned over the table, cutting off any chance for Mark to explain. "Looks like you've drawn quite the crowd, buddy." Mark shot the tall man a glare. "She's just someone I know." But the tension crackling in the air felt like a live wire. The tall man surveyed the woman, sizing her up. "Interesting friends you've picked." Maybe you should leave him alone, she said, her tone now firm, not backing down in the face of the challenge. There was a fierce protectiveness in her eyes, and Mark realized she was willing to stand up for him. But before Mark could respond, the tall man smirked and leaned back in his seat once more. Oh, we're just having a friendly chat. Mark despised the way he referred to her, a patronizing jab that only added fuel to the fire. This isn't just a friendly chat, he said, his voice rising slightly. The tall man shrugged, feigning indifference. Whatever you say, just make sure you play your cards right. The words hung in the air, thick and filled with implications that left Mark reeling. He could feel every set of eyes in the diner glancing his way, some with curious interest, others with the specter of judgment lingering just beneath the surface. Mark turned back to the woman, unwilling to show how rattled he felt. I don't want you to get mixed up in this, he said quietly, all the defiance slipping from his voice. But before she could respond, the tall man interrupted. Oh, I'd say she's already mixed up in it. Mark felt an icy grip on his heart. Just a few words and the situation had twisted, turning what felt like a minor confrontation into an unpredictable storm. The woman glanced at Mark, uncertainty flashing across her face, and in that moment he felt the weight of their connection, an unspoken bond that went far beyond mere acquaintanceship. It was then that the door swung open one last time. The ringing bell announced the arrival of a man in a dark suit, his presence commanding yet strangely calm. He stepped inside, scanning the diner before his eyes landed on Mark and the group surrounding him. Mark's breath caught as he recognized him, a figure from his past, someone he had hoped never to see again. The man moved with purpose, navigating through the tables, his eyes locked onto Mark with an intensity that sent a jolt through him. Mark, he said, his voice cool and unnervingly collected, cutting through the tension like a knife. Mark's heart dropped, the air felt too tight, the walls closing in around him as he caught the gaze of the tall man shifting slightly, tension radiating from him like an electric shock. Questions raced through Mark's mind. Did he come here looking for him? Did his presence signal trouble? As the man's eyes swept across the diner, it felt like everything ground to a halt. He turned, locking eyes with the tall man, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Suddenly, every choice Mark had made felt more consequential than ever. The weight of the situation crashed down on him. His mind raced as he realized he was at a crossroads, and with that one unexpected statement, everything was about to change. Mark, the man in the suit, pressed again, a hint of urgency creeping into his voice. The world felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and he knew that moment would define everything. In the charged air of the diner, surrounded by the judgment of strangers, Mark had to decide. Would he face his future head-on, or would he succumb to the shadows of his past? He felt the eyes checking his face again, the weight of every decision pressing down. The tension stretched like a taut string, ready to snap, as Mark stood at the precipice of an uncertain fate.